So welcome back, guys. Today we're talking with Blake, who's from the Herbal Equivalent. Blake studied psychology and nutrition at university, and he's done research on topics such as obesity psychology. He has a blog, a podcast, a YouTube channel. I'm going to link all of those down below. He has some great information, and he's really big on self-experimenting and using supplements to optimize his health. So today we're going to be talking about some claims made around keto and talking about whether the research backs them up, so if they're true or not. So why don't you introduce yourself, Blake?
All right. Yeah. So I started off just kind of like overweight and obese as a kid, just through a family where, we were all overweight and obese. And I think at my max, I was around 230 pounds. So pretty heavy, which I guess in, equivalent to kilograms, about 104 kilograms. So pretty big. And that was at 14 years old. So if you can imagine, like 14-year-old kid, 5'9" or so. And I was pretty heavy, and I was just kind of like tired of being this fat kid. And so I started exercising around that time. And just with exercise alone, I only lost about 8 pounds with lifting weights, doing cardio. But I started to eventually focus on diet after that, and eventually ended up losing about 50 plus pounds. And then over the years have gotten more into, like trying to put on muscle and everything like that. I actually did that with like kind of like a higher carb, it was called the GI diet. Just basically
Okay.
based around, like lower glycemic carbohydrates and stuff like that. Still a lot of, like pastas, basically like, you swap out your your white pasta with whole wheat pasta. And it was just like, it worked. It definitely did work, but I think over time, I just kind of ended up slipping back into some bad eating habits over the time. And, my diet back then was kind of like very like bodybuilder-esque. And
Yeah.
so it was just like a lot of, I was more focused around macro. So it was just like, lots of carbohydrates, lots of protein shakes and lean protein and, lots of supplements and things like that. And then whenever I graduated high school, I actually decided to start pursuing side jobs in the supplement industry while I was going to school. And I initially wanted to study dietetics, but whenever I actually got into the coursework of dietetics and you actually start learning about it, it's very heavily biased towards the, traditional thinking, junk food industries. If you go to like dietetics conferences, you'll see sponsorships by Coke and, all these
Oh,
junk food
geez.
industry, Kraft and whatnot. And so I actually decided to minor in nutrition after that, instead kind of like focus my efforts on psychology. And I was really interested in how food, nutrition, and supplements interact with brain chemistry in particular, and how you can sort of optimize your cognition and whatnot using those various principles.
Okay. Yeah. The the universities seem to be a bit dated with the information that they're pushing out, is
Yeah.
what I've found as well. So what are your thoughts on keto specifically?
So I experimented with it a couple of times because I did a lot of different diet experiments. And whenever I was a teenager, I had this one experiment with it where it was really based around just like processed meats, processed cheese, just like really horrible stuff. It was like the worst quality, just go to Walmart and buy just like all the basically like crap quality keto foods that you can. And I was doing a lot of like cycling and stuff like that at the time. And I experienced a lot of bonking, and I just didn't really feel very good overall. And I had a lot of digestive issues too at the time. And so I just kind of like threw it out the window, gave it up. And then I tried again, and just kind of like underate while I was doing it. And so I had zero energy whatsoever. About like 2 or 3 weeks in, I was just like completely just dying. I'd go to work and I'm just like, just walking around in a haze, zero energy. And then one more time while I was on a work training trip, I decided to actually give it one more try. And this time I actually really focused on, high nutrient quality, getting enough calories, and it actually started to work for me. And I really wanted to find a diet that would provide me with, like steady energy and clear skin, since I've always struggled with like skin issues. And my diet before that was very kind of like paleo focused. So a lot of like meat, potatoes, veggies, and fruit. I joked on my podcast before that I basically had a meat and potatoes diet. And, that's essentially what it was. And, it was sort of working. But, for all intents and purposes, it was like I would a lot of times slip into eating, just like kind of like higher carb junk foods and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that can be considered paleo that are like really, kind of
Pushing it,
junky.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like, if you cover nuts in honey, well, that's technically paleo, but at the same time, it's like it's a sugar and fat bomb mixed together, which is, as we know, not a really good combination.
Yeah.
But, what I find with keto personally is that I don't really feel hungry all the time. I don't get the blood sugar swings like I used to, and I have, generally more mental clarity, and I maintain and build muscle actually better than on a high carb diet. The only caveat really that I find for myself is that my endurance kind of sucks. If I want to go running, like my heart rate gets sky high no matter what, even if I like salt load and everything like that.
Oh,
It's just
really?
like, yeah, my
Yeah.
running completely sucks, but my strength is largely unaffected on it. But I do feel a lot lower inflammation, less stress overall. And, I think that it's really better overall for my body in particular, because I think on the higher carb diet, one of the reasons that I had issue building muscle is that there's actually an optimal level of inflammation that you're supposed to have following workouts in order to make proper adaptations. And if you have too much inflammation, you actually won't build muscle. If you have too little inflammation, you won't build muscle either. So it's kind of like the same thing in terms of the training stress whenever you're getting that antioxidant response after you work out, and then all these enzymes are elevated and everything like that. Workout exercise in general is oxidative, but you get an antioxidant boost. If you do too much, then it's detrimental over time too. So I think that inflammation balance really helped me out.
So before we dig into some of the keto claims that we're going to talk about today, let's briefly talk about what makes a study or a research paper credible. For a lot of normal people just looking into this, there's a lot of contradicting information and a lot of bias in studies and things like that. So let's just touch on that for a minute.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the first things you want to look at is, is it a human study or animal study, or even, an in vitro, which is basically like a petri dish or test tube study. And so the way that I look at it is like a lot of the animal studies are just kind of like stepping stones. They can help to explain some of the mechanisms of action, which are really not practical or ethical to conduct in humans. You can't, do an intervention in humans and then, dissect them and figure out what's happening inside of their body. But you can also do other things like measure neurotransmitters, the effects of, intervention on lifespan, since lab mice typically don't live very long. But we don't have the same anatomy or natural diets or nutrient requirements. There's also certain things that are toxic to us that aren't when given to an animal, and vice versa. And those controlled lab experiments don't always give you a picture of real life, humans, actually in going about their business and their normal day-to-day lives. And then we also have the experimental versus observational research. And the observational research just kind of looks at how people are in their natural environments and how they live. And that kind of shows you how things operate in the real world. But it's very difficult sometimes to tease out the effects of specific protocols and dietary habits. You get a lot of noise in the background, basically.
Yeah.
And, in a lot of these health studies, there's the healthy user bias, which a lot of people are aware of by now, where some people just have like generally overall healthier lifestyle habits. So they don't smoke, they don't drink, they're not doing drugs and things like that. They actually exercise, they have better hygiene overall. So they tend to get sick less often, they have less issues. And a lot of times it requires a lot of that extensive, statistical manipulation in order to actually tease out what it is you're looking for out of an observational study. So, there's pros and cons to it, but it's like observational studies should be seen more as a way to actually make hypotheses about certain things that you would actually then later test in a controlled clinical trial.
Okay, so perfect. Let's start getting into some of the keto claims. So the first one I hear a lot is that calories don't matter on keto. What are your thoughts on that?
So that one is pretty much untrue. If you actually look at it in metabolic ward studies where they're tightly controlling calories, they can actually measure out the food and everything like that, calculate how many calories are in it, and these people are actually being tested for their metabolic rates and everything like that. There's basically no difference whatsoever. We do know that, keto diets cause faster initial weight loss, and that's due to the dumping of water. Whenever you have less insulin secretion, you dump water and electrolytes, since insulin actually makes you retain water. Carbohydrates make you retain more water. But the differences tend to even out over time. So whenever you're talking, a couple weeks, the differences in weight loss actually tend to even out. And that, unfortunately, it somewhat supports the calories in versus calories out method,
Yeah.
which I know a lot of people really don't like the idea of. I mean, it's not as simple as calories in versus calories out, because there's also hormonal fluctuations and things like that. You also have to take into account nutrient partitioning and, are you losing fat and preserving muscle mass as well? And that's another big one. Whenever you're losing weight, you don't want to lose your muscle mass, because then your metabolism slows down too. And it's easier for some people to lose weight on keto than other diets. And I think that's the big picture here. And that's because of things like better satiety, better blood sugar control, more metabolic flexibility. But it really depends on the person. Some people are going to do better on just, like a standard, 40 or 50% carbohydrate diet in terms of weight loss over the long term, if they find it easier to stick to, because it's more about what you can stick to if you're just talking about weight loss. And, it's also definitely possible to gain weight on keto. I've done this personally. I've used it as more of like a muscle building diet than something to, lose weight. And it's just like, all you have to do is eat more food. If you're eating too much, then you're going to gain weight no matter what. It's just like, what type of weight are you gaining? Are you gaining healthy weight? Are you gaining lean body mass? Or are you gaining fat mass? And there's another big issue in, this dietary research, where the PIs, or principal investigators, are often constrained by money, even personal knowledge, and bias whenever they're designing the studies. That's true of both people who design, favorable studies on keto or high carb. I've seen both. And this diet research is pretty notorious for giving the participants horrible quality food. So I remember one of the studies that we examined whenever we were going over MCT oil in one of our first episodes. They're giving these people like these horrible quality, like, baked muffins, and it's a way to actually give them MCT oil. And it's funny because a lot of the researchers aren't very well versed on what makes a healthy diet either. Some of the people that I used to work with back in the lab that I used to work in, I remember we were doing research on this one weight loss shake made by Nestle, of all people. And, this shake was basically made of like soy protein and maltodextrin and like a bunch of, vitamins and minerals and stuff added to it, because it was supposed to be like you drank nothing but this shake in order to lose weight. And, it was just like the worst quality thing. And I remember sitting there criticizing it. And this person that I worked with in the lab, she was just like, "Oh, well, what's wrong with that?" It's like, this quality is so horrible. I don't know why you would ever want to put this in your body. But the other thing about the studies over the long term is that they don't take into account the health outcomes of the participants either. So if you're just looking at weight loss, that's not a very reliable indicator of health overall, because you can lose weight doing all sorts of things. You can lose weight smoking crystal meth, but that doesn't necessarily make it doesn't necessarily make it a healthy thing. And you also have to look at, how are these people doing after a year or longer on the diet? But that type of study in a metabolic ward would be extremely expensive. I mean, you're talking like millions of dollars in order to conduct a study. Not many people or organizations are willing to fund that. You also have to look at, over time, are they nutrient deficient? So, a lot of the people in the keto community like to talk about, like veganism. It's like, over the long term, you do tend to run into a lot of nutrient deficiencies on it. So it's like, you can show in the short term that a vegan diet looks really good, but then whenever you actually extrapolate it over a longer period of time, whenever you start running into nutrient deficiencies and things like that, then it's like, well, is it really a healthy diet? Well, probably not. You also have to look at what these people's metabolic health is like. So, are they insulin resistant after a long time? Are they actually seeing improvements in their metabolism? What's their disease risk like over time? And you can usually see that in like these longer term like cohort studies where they tell people to do a certain thing. But the problem with that is that you have to like trust that the people are still doing the intervention, which is very hard to do. And, your compliance rates for a lot of studies can just vary depending on what intervention you're giving them. And you can't really force them to do it either. You really have to trust them. They could be lying. And that's another issue with, whenever you talk about like food frequency questionnaires, people are really bad at knowing what they ate and actually being able to recall what they ate. That was one of the things in my thesis whenever I was preparing that. I actually found a lot of research that was criticizing these food frequency questionnaires because they were finding that, especially as people get more overweight and obese, they actually tend to do worse on the food frequency questionnaires. They tend to be worse at estimating how much food they're actually eating. They'll say, oh yeah, I'm eating 1,500 calories a day. But whenever you actually, weigh out their food and everything like that, they're eating more like 3,500 calories a day. And it's, you can see the huge discrepancy there.
Yeah. No, it's really hard. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So that is diets high in saturated fat are going to raise your cholesterol. So let's dig into that.
All right. So first we have to talk about, different types of cholesterol. There's obviously LDL, HDL. They're not actually cholesterol. They're transport proteins for cholesterol in your body. And there's different densities of them. So there's different densities of LDL particles where, you have like the very low density lipoprotein, which is really prone to being oxidized. And that's really the main issue there is the oxidation of cholesterol. That is one of the main driving factors versus just having cholesterol in your body. And the thing is, yes, a diet high in saturated fat can raise your cholesterol. It really depends on the individual. Some people are more genetically susceptible than others. Me in particular, I got some blood work recently after doing keto for a little bit. And yeah, my cholesterol was sky high. I mean, like, my LDL was like 300 and something, I think, which, I didn't get the particle count test, so I really don't know, what the breakdown of that is. But my HDL was also really high. My triglycerides were really low, so I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about it is like it's dependent on so many different factors. LDL itself is not just like an independent risk factor for heart disease on its own. And there's other studies that you can look at too where keto can actually lower blood lipids in some people. That's more dependent on whether or not they're losing weight. So typically whenever people lose weight, their blood lipids tend to lower. If you're eating in an excess, your blood lipids will tend to rise usually. And that's could be one of the reasons too. Well, I've also seen like an increase in LDL is like, I was purposely overeating just a little bit because I'm just, trying to gain a little bit more muscle mass. And it's also what you do in the days prior to taking it. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Dave Feldman before. He's done a lot of those tests before on his cholesterol. And, he's shown that you can literally alter your cholesterol in 2 or 3 days, like drastically by 100, 150 points.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen those.
But yeah, I mean, there's other people that have found that even if they have really high cholesterol in keto, they go and get, artery scans, coronary artery scans, and they have like literally no evidence of plaque formation. So that kind of, tells you that it's not just LDL that you should be worried about. Your general oxidative stress is another big factor. Also your blood pressure too. How's your blood pressure doing? And your arterial stiffness. If you're doing things that cause damage to your arteries. So if you're doing, really, really intense exercise, if you're smoking, if you're doing anything that damages the arteries, that is what is going to probably lead to more oxidation and actually, be a precursor to the formation of plaques in the arteries. So this whole topic really isn't fully understood. A lot more doctors and researchers are beginning to believe that the reason that the cholesterol actually deposits into the arteries is mostly due to the arterial damage itself, where it's like acting more like a bandage.
Yeah.
And also you have other things like high calcium levels in the blood, which, if that's not directed by K2 into the correct places, then that's where you can get buildups of calcium deposits as well. That's really bad for your arteries. So, there's also what they've talked about, the lean mass hyperresponder. That's someone who, typically sees sky high LDL levels on keto, lower triglycerides, but also high HDL. That profile is typically not associated with long-term risk of heart disease. There needs to be a lot more research into it, obviously, since there isn't, a whole lot of research, especially long-term on keto diets. Most of the stuff is going to be anecdotal, but you can see from a lot of these anecdotal claims whenever people are actually doing a healthful keto diet, not like a really horrible junk food type keto diet where they're eating, vegetable oils and just processed junk all day, they tend to actually do better in the long term.
So the next keto claim is that keto is only good for weight loss. It's not good for your overall health. And what do you think about that?
All right. So there are some additional benefits. Obviously, one of the original conceptions of the keto diet a long time ago was for seizure control. Since, ketones have effects on the neurotransmitters and neurons in the brain. There's also some other benefits that people tend to see, like cognitive functioning, steady overall energy. Some people can actually, like I said, before, gain weight on keto. That's what I've used it before. That's what I've used it for personally. And in terms of things like cognitive functioning, ketones are pretty easily used by the brain. In some cases, the brain will actually prefer ketones. Sometimes it'll prefer glucose, just depending on the actual area of the brain and, what type of fuel substrates are actually available. It's also an alternative fuel source whenever people have impaired glucose metabolism in the brain. So, for example, in Alzheimer's, they tend to not be able to actually use glucose properly. Other neurodegenerative disorders, they have issues with glucose metabolism in the brain as well. Ketones can be a really good alternative in that sense. Also, without the blood sugar swings, people tend to have better clarity of thought. If your blood sugar, everyone knows that feeling whenever your blood sugar drops and then you have no mental clarity whatsoever. Your brain's foggy, you can't remember anything, you can't think clearly. And there's also some neuroprotective benefits to ketone metabolism versus glucose metabolism in the long term, where ketone metabolism tends to cause less oxidative stress overall in the brain. So it just really depends on the individual. But and then the other benefits like energy, obviously when people become insulin resistant, they experience those energy swings. Or if you're just eating a lot of high glycemic carbohydrates throughout the day and you don't have good glucose control, then you'll run into energy issues. But blood sugar tends to be a lot more balanced whenever you're not eating very high carbs. Your insulin is also pretty low most of the time, and you don't have those you don't have those like blood sugar fluctuations. I've done some blood sugar experiments myself on keto, and typically after most meals, it never goes above like 95. And that's even if I have some carbohydrates from like eating yogurt or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's a really good thing, because sometimes if I eat, other types of carbohydrates, like I did in that one experiment with the dates, it went up to like 126. And, even though that's supposed to be like a normal response, I felt so weird while I was doing that experiment. But yeah. Also, other benefits like inflammation, benefits for the immune system. Some people will find that they have lower inflammation on keto. That could be due to less oxidative stress, since carbohydrate metabolism can cause more free radical production overall. And that can lead to, like more muscle soreness and stuff like that following workouts, just more inflammation in general. It really depends on how your metabolism works personally and how efficient you are at actually burning carbs versus burning fats for energy. And people will also find that their immune systems function better. Like, so for example, whenever I eat lower carb, I tend to have better immune system functioning, like being around sick people all the time. Even like my girlfriend, she's been sick right next to me, everything like that. Never caught it. I've been around people at work and stuff like that, and they're just coughing and wheezing everywhere. Haven't caught anything, knock on wood.
Yeah.
But a lot of people do find that they tend to get sick less often.
Yeah, I found that as well. My boyfriend was sick a couple weeks ago with a cold, and I didn't catch it. I was like, nice. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next one. A lot of people think that you can't exercise on keto. So specifically doing like weightlifting, they think that that's not possible, that you need more glucose. What are your thoughts on
So this is going to be one that might upset some people, but
that?
so the thing is, like, obviously most people will see an initial dip in performance while adapting to a ketogenic diet, and it takes different amounts of time for different people. So there's no set rule. I've seen so many things online where people set these rules like, oh yeah, it takes 2 weeks. Oh yeah, it takes 1 month. Oh yeah, it takes 6 months. It takes a year or whatever. It's just like there's no set amount of time. It's really dependent on your personal state, where you're at in your life, and how trained you are, everything like that, where you're coming from in terms of your insulin sensitivity and whatnot. And it also depends on other factors like your metabolic efficiency and your gluconeogenesis rates, as well as your ability to deliver oxygen to your muscles effectively. And the oxygen delivery is a really big factor, since fat metabolism requires a lot more oxygen than carb metabolism. Carbs can be metabolized in an anaerobic environment, whereas fats do require a lot more oxygen. And anaerobic activity will also still be reliant on fuel sources like creatine phosphate and glycogen. So it really depends on the activity that you're doing. And so the athletes who can't deliver oxygen to the muscles efficiently will probably suffer the most. So if you have really bad blood flow, or if you're just really not aerobically efficient, that's whenever you're going to really suffer. Also, if you try to attempt a lot of repeated bursts of intense effort, that's still going to require glucose as an energy source. And it really depends on how well you are at sparing glycogen, how much fat you can actually burn. Like the percentage of fat that you can burn at higher intensities matters as well, which tends to increase as you become more efficient. As the longer you train, training properly is another way too. You have to train your aerobic system properly. And the other thing too that I've found personally is that you can get drastic increases in heart rate too. That's basically due to the water loss that you get on keto. And some people just don't hold on to water very efficiently. I don't. Whenever I drop carbohydrates, and even like I said, with all the salt in the world, like I can drink like pickle juice and stuff like that, still don't hold on to water very well. But that basically can cause lower blood volume, lower blood pressure, and so your heart rate increases in order to compensate. And that can cause like dizziness and some things like that whenever you start going up there in intensity. But that type of activity is more relevant to competition than training. There are a lot of people who can train well on keto, but whenever they actually go to competition, they'll fuel up with carbohydrates, just depending on the type of activity that they're doing. Also, the other thing is a lot of people get burned out whenever they're trying to train at really high intensities, just over long periods of time. So think like people who are doing CrossFit, or they're doing HIIT workouts, like 4 or 5 times a week and stuff like that. You tend to get burned out really fast on that, and you'll get burned out faster if you're doing keto, since you're not replacing those carbs, especially if you haven't really taken the time to, build your, I guess, like fat burning machinery, if you could call it. And that's more about sticking to the whole like 80-20 rule, which a lot of people are now talking about, where it's like you do 80% of your training at really low intensities, 20% of your training at these higher intensities, so that you don't really get burnt out over time, because you're also increasing cortisol. You're causing a lot of hormonal changes to your body whenever you're doing that. And the other thing is, like, your metabolic efficiency can be determined by really two different parameters, and that's how easily you burn fat at higher intensities and how much energy you waste through heat and also bad form. So, if you're going out there and you have really bad form while you're performing your exercises, you're wasting a lot of energy. Also, if you haven't really developed the ability to burn fat at higher intensities, then you're going to be burning more carbohydrates, and that's going to be detrimental if you're trying to do keto at the same time. So some people may require slightly higher carbs, but the magic about this is that if you are training at higher intensities, you can actually eat higher carbohydrates and stay in ketosis. There's some people who can get away with 100 to 150 grams of carbs a day and literally still register like 1.0 or more ketones in their blood. So
Yeah.
it just really depends on your training volume and how much you're doing. If you're sedentary, if you have an office job, if you're just sitting around all day, and then you go to the gym for like an hour or something like that, you're probably not going to get away with that many carbohydrates. But, personally, I found that I can get away with, anywhere from 100 to 150 grams per, just depending on the timing. Like if I time it before and after a workout, I'll be back in ketosis really easily within a couple of hours. So it really just depends. And sometimes those supplemental carbs can actually help some people out, especially if you're doing that heavy training and glycolytic activity. Your gluconeogenesis rates also will play a factor into it. So if your body is really efficient at making glucose from protein and you have a high protein intake, sometimes you can get away with having really, really low carbs and doing heavy glycolytic activity. So some people, that would be an example, would be like Sean Baker, he basically eats no carbohydrates, but whenever he's posted his like blood glucose test, it's like 120 or something like that fasting. It's like obviously his body is producing a lot of sugar, and he's also said that he's had his muscle glycogen tested, and his muscles are usually pretty saturated with glycogen despite eating no carbs. So it's pretty obvious that he has a really high rate of gluconeogenesis. But some people are not going to have that. This is also dependent on genetics, how long you've been doing the diet, and everything like that. So it's, like I said, it's just like really personal. You have to kind of like tailor the keto diet to what you're doing, and you have to kind of like figure out what you can get away with and what you can't. So like me, for instance, whenever I'm going into doing obstacle course racing, with the running in particular, I tend to burn a lot more carbohydrates doing that, just burning off glycogen. And I can add in those extra carbs, and it seems to help quite a bit, but I'll still be able to register pretty decent levels of ketones, and it's not negatively affecting my blood sugar. And some people will actually need to keep their, carbohydrates really, really low. And some people, like I said, some people just won't be able to exercise very well on keto, but it really depends on what you're doing. I think that's the biggest context of it, because you have some studies, like a lot of the studies that have evaluated exercise on keto, whenever they're looking at like aerobic performance, you can average out the data, and it looks like, there's no difference. But whenever you actually look at the individual data points, there's like one person here is improving, one person is, really suffering, another person improved drastically, another person is like really, really suffering. And it just really individually depends. But the thing is, if you average out that data, you can make it look like there's not really any change.
Okay.
But that's the thing about it. Also, it depends on the type of exercise, like I said, that they're doing. For example, there's other studies that have looked at, like 1 rep max type training, or even just like single sets, seeing, I think there was this one on like Italian gymnasts, for example. They found that keto didn't really affect their performance. But they were also not really doing very glycogen depleting activity. They were just doing like a single set of random body weight exercises, for example. And, I personally, like, I do calisthenics as my main exercise. And, I don't really find that keto really negatively affects that. But if I start to try to do like a lot of like sprinting and jumping and running and stuff like that, things that are really heavily dependent on glycogen, that's whenever I have to start to up the carbohydrates in order to actually still maintain that type of activity without suffering.
All right. So the next one is that macros are all that matters. So basically all carbs are the same, all fats are the same. So I talk a lot about vegetable oil and how terrible it is. And yeah, pretty much will something like that's a fat have the same impact on your body as something like coconut oil, for example?
Not at all. It's really dependent on quality. So also, yeah, the type of fatty acids that you're consuming. So since a lot of those polyunsaturated fats are oxidized by the time you're actually getting them in an oil forms because of the way that they extract them. Also, a lot of people tend to do a lot of high heat cooking with them, deep frying and pan searing and things like that. Those oils tend to oxidize. That is really, really bad for your health. That's really bad for your actual lipid oxidation in your body as well. And the other thing too is like, throughout human history, we haven't really had access to a lot of polyunsaturated fats in the diet. So, whenever you look at, for example, animal fats, they are primarily saturated in monounsaturated fat. Depending on the animal, it's usually around 50-50, 40-60, somewhere in that range. And other things like nut consumption. Nuts are typically high in polyunsaturated fats. But the other thing is, like, if you actually go out in nature and you try to find a lot of nuts, you're really not going to find that many. Even here in Texas, we have pecan trees growing all around. But, by the time pecan season comes around and you can actually go and find them, a lot of times, other animals have gotten to them first, or they're, you crack them open and they're rancid, or, they're moldy and stuff like that. So it's like the actual amount of edible nuts that you could get would be very, very low. So that kind of shows you that we really don't really have a need for that high polyunsaturated fat content, even though we do require them in order to survive. But the saturated and monounsaturated fats are a lot safer to consume in high amounts because they're not oxidized. They're also a lot more heat stable as well. You can typically cook with things like, avocado oil at much higher temperatures. You can cook with ghee at much higher temperatures. And the other thing is, like, personally, I'm not a big fan of oil. Whenever you're just talking about, basic extracted oils, even like coconut oil or like avocado oil, mainly because they lack nutrients. They're not very high in nutrients. But if you're using something like butter or ghee or tallow, lard, things like that, they'll at least provide a higher amount of fat soluble vitamins. So you're going to be getting some vitamin A, some vitamin E, possibly some vitamin D, vitamin K2 and whatnot. I think that moderate amounts of certain things, like mainly monounsaturated fat oils like avocado, olive oil, MCT oil, are probably fine in the long run. But I think if you're using them as a large portion of your diet, you're probably shortchanging yourself on nutrients in the long term, unless you're eating extremely nutrient dense foods, which, I know that you eat liver. I do too. I love liver. I'll even eat cod liver. I started eating that recently, which I don't really enjoy the taste. I don't enjoy the taste or texture of it, but it's just like I do it for the nutritional value of it. It's also really, really high in omega-3s. You can take like just a couple of teaspoons of the oil off of I just get like the canned cod liver and just a couple teaspoons and you got like 7 or 8 grams of omega-3s really easily.
Crazy.
So, but the other thing is, like, the bigger picture, we saw the detrimental effects of that, like, whole the only macros count in like the early iterations of the keto diet. Also, I remember whenever I was in college studying dietetics, and they were talking about, therapeutic keto diets, they were like, oh yeah, lunch meat and just like, regular cream cheese bought from the store, and, pour some olive oil on it and pour some vegetable oil on it. And it was
Yeah.
just like the worst type of diet. And I'm like, well, no wonder these people are getting nutrient deficient on those types of diets. And then you also have some iterations of keto, which are, the McDonald's keto, or they go and, they're eating Quest bars and stuff like that all day. And it's like, sure, it's
Yeah.
technically keto, but it's, you're shortchanging yourself on a lot of nutrition, and you're also introducing, a lot of potentially harmful chemicals to your body at the same time. And really, the quality of your food overall is pretty much the most important factor. Regardless of whether you want to do keto or, like a higher carb diet, whatever it is. Because even, like if you look at some of the blue zones, that have higher carbohydrate content diets, and they live for a long time, it's like, the main difference is not the macro ratios, because if you look at the macro ratios compared to people who are getting high amounts of disease, they're really similar. But the biggest thing there is the quality of the food. They're eating whole foods, they're not
Yeah.
processing their foods extensively, eating vegetable oils and things like that. They also have a lot of other healthy lifestyle habits as well. But overall, my opinions on the whole subject is like, I think keto is a great tool that people can use. I don't necessarily think it's best for everyone in every single context. I know some people I guess some people think that way, that keto is best for everyone in every single context. I don't necessarily believe that personally. I think people can thrive on all sorts of diets as long as, what they're doing is healthy for them. As long as their disease risk is low, people have lived and thrived on all sorts of diets and whatnot. I mean, but I guess you can, take everything with a grain of salt, because some people live to 100 smoking cigarettes and
I
drinking alcohol
know.
every day. So it's one of those things where it's really hard to know in the long term.
Yeah. I think you just have to try things for yourself, try different ways of eating, see what's working for you, make sure you're
Mhm.
not nutrient deficient. But yeah, I totally agree that quality is the most important factor.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Blake. That was awesome. I think you really, yeah, just answered all of those and put some of those to rest. So, yeah, where can everyone find you?
Yeah, so I have a podcast. Podcast is called the Herbal Equivalent. It's on basically every major podcast platform, so iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, all of those. It's also hosted on Libsyn, so you can go check it out there. I have a website at theherbalequivalent.com with all of the articles and stuff like that. I'm usually a little bit behind on the articles versus the podcasts. The podcasts are a lot easier for me to put out than the articles, but they're still over there, where I usually cite all the research that I actually do for each individual podcast episode. I don't cite all of it, just because it's like, sometimes the amount of citations would be astronomical. I wouldn't even have time for it and a job at the same time. So, but yeah, that's those are the main places that people can go find it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All
Thanks for
right.
having me on.